All right. So my name is Robert Olson. I teach at the University of New York Fredonia, SUNY Fredonia. I'm in the Department of Computer and Information Sciences. And privacy, I think, is a really interesting, it's a very interesting subject matter. And it's not necessarily something that students are really getting exposed to at the undergraduate level all that much, I think. There's very little content, I think, being produced by academia in this area, and it's something I really wanted to do a little bit more of, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So first of all, quick about me. I've got 2 graduate degrees, cognitive science, MIS. My background is really in expert systems and data mining, which is, I think, not necessarily something that it's not really a subject area that lends itself to being too concerned about privacy. I mean, oftentimes data miners are the ones violating your privacy, right? I've done a couple of security certs. If you are interested in doing security certs, I would say just do the PWK and OSCP. It's going to kick your ass, but that's where it's at. Okay, after starting PWK, that is what I am preparing my students to do. Okay, I've been teaching for 7 years, a variety of upper-level classes in security, AI, and data mining. I've done some research in educational data mining, looking at building social graphs of student behavioral networks in order to fight bullying. And lately, I've also gotten interested in developing privacy-protecting network protocols. So basically, baking privacy into the OSI model at a lower level. Lots of work to be done there. So, in terms of privacy, in terms of my interest in privacy, well, I got interested in privacy about 2012, 2013, when we started finding a lot more out about what companies like Facebook were doing. The Snowden leaks, of course. And one of the things that really interested me in privacy in these areas is that as an early internet user, I say early, I mean in the late 90s, early 2000s, we sort of assumed, I think, that a lot of the information we were posting was private. Okay? If you think about now, everyone sort of assumes, at least to a certain extent, that the things you post on Facebook are public in some respect. Okay, there's very little expectation of complete and total privacy on Facebook. Now compare that to LiveJournal in like 2003. Okay, I think those are very different levels of expectations. So my interest in privacy has been sort of stemmed from the fact that the expectations of privacy have significantly lessened over the last 10 years or so. And now we're at a place where we sort of know that social media is violating privacy, or at least has the potential to violate privacy, and that's not something that we were initially aware of. Now, this is also something I've kind of seen in my students. So my students have seemed in general to be relatively uninformed about issues relating to privacy. So in one of my classes in the spring of 2014, I was teaching a class on computer security and ethics. Okay, that's our introductory computer security course. It's kind of aligned to OSCP SSCP content. And in that class, I had students who didn't recognize the name Edward Snowden, didn't know what the NSA was, didn't realize that Google was mining emails, and that was particularly interesting for us because as a university, we use Gmail. Okay, so this is something that directly impacted our students. They had no idea that their emails were being mined. And actually during the spring of 2014, I want to say maybe it was April of that year, Google announced that they were going to stop doing that for their educational partners. So there was some good discussion to be had on there. And while students may have realized that social media sites were sort of tracking their behavior to a certain extent, they had no idea that their data was a commodity. Now, when I thought about it for my students, these facts actually made a lot of sense. So let me bring up why. So SUNY Fredonia, we're a fairly small liberal arts school. We've got about 5,000 students or so. And when I say we're in New York, we are about as far from the city as you can possibly be and still be in the state. So you can see the little red dot there. We're about 50 miles south of Buffalo. And I've got an overhead picture of the campus. If you go a mile kind of up, you hit the lake, you hit Lake Erie. And if you go a mile or so in any other direction, you hit farm country. All right? Now, that's a sort of a climate that doesn't really experience a lot of surveillance issues. Okay, on top of that, we don't even experience a lot of tech issues in general. You have to go an hour to hit you have to travel an hour to get to the nearest Best Buy. All right? So what we have, in some ways, is a little bit of a tech desert, which makes these privacy issues not as relevant to people's lives. Now, in terms of my student population, you can see that most of our students are from the Western New York area, either Western New York or the Genesee Valley, which is also very close to us, very rural areas. So most of our students are from this sort of relatively low-tech area. So it really wasn't, we sort of have geography against us a little bit in terms of being informed about privacy issues. Now, in terms of the breakdown of our majors, you can also see that our majors are really sort of heavily into arts, into the humanities, and into education. Once again, disciplines that don't really focus that much on privacy issues. In fact, some of the most really grievous privacy concerns are coming out of educational institutions these days. Okay? So you look at tracking of students and their behavior out of schools, actual literal tracking of students via RFID chips, etc. So education as a discipline tends to be on the other side of this issue. And first, there are some good arguments there. But what this is sort of produced is an academic environment that really it's a very liberal academic environment, but not one that focuses on privacy issues. So what I wanted to do was teach a class on privacy. Okay, so I sort of, described the problem that our students weren't really getting the information they needed about privacy. The solution, of course, as an academic, is to teach a class on privacy. So I did. And the breakdown, before I get into this, I want to sort of mention the breakdown of my students that I had for this. As you can see, I had, for the class I taught, I had a really wide variety of students. One sole computer science major. Okay. Most of my students were from social sciences. Psychology being the one spike. I'm not sure what it was about psychology students that they seemed to be interested in this class, but that's what happened. And I also had a very even distribution, almost a perfect distribution of students in terms of seniority. So that ended up being really interesting. So as I said, my solution to the problem was, of course, teach a class on privacy. So now, how am I going to go about doing this? Well, if you haven't ever taught a college course before or proposed a college course before, the approval process is, let's say, challenging. Okay, the bureaucracy of academic institutions tends to rival any of the other institutions you see with lots of bureaucracy. On top of that, interdisciplinary courses tend to get people's feathers ruffled. Okay, so if a good example of this was when we were looking at doing a web design major, And of course, the visual arts department kind of felt like they were getting their toes stepped on a little bit because we wanted to do something with design. So sort of bringing this, so I had a couple of things lined up against this. Additionally, if you want students to take a class, you have to give them some incentive. Okay? Very few students are going to take classes just for fun or just for personal interest. It happens from time to time, but it's certainly not the norm. So I either had to have this class count towards a major or as a general education credit. And I ultimately decided to go with the latter. But one thing to note about general education classes is that the grade distribution, at least in terms of general education classes in tech, tends to be a little bit concerning. Okay, so this is an example of a typical grade distribution for an introductory computer science course. You have a lot of people up in the A's and B end, up in the A and B end, and a lot of people down in the F and D end, but very few people in the middle. Okay, and this is for good reason. As people working in technology, we often forget that tech is in fact kind of hard. Okay, think about when you first learned to program. If you ever learned to program, think about how that was. That was not an easy thing to do. So, and as a note, by the way, most general education classes in computer science or in technology fall into one of two categories. They're either A, here's how to write, here's some basic programming class, which very, very heavily tracks this. Or B, it's a sort of a computer science overview class where you might do a little programming, a little bit about of application work, a little bit of hardware, etc. So it's a nice broad overview. But this is very common. So ultimately, my solution to this was to go with a general education class and to do what our school calls an honors class. So this honors class was hacking, surveillance, and privacy. Now, as an honors course, I would have certainly a higher quality of student for the first run, which would help me to make sure that, if I saw students experiencing difficulties, it would sort of mean it was more like there was work that I would have to do, more work that I would have to do, and that there was less of a student influence on how the class is going. There's also less bureaucracy. Our honors program basically handles classes, its course approval process, much like a CFP. So they put out a call for honors classes, and professors submit some things that sound interesting to them, and the head of the honors program decides what to run and what not to run. So we've had some interesting things in the past: molecular astronomy for a chemistry credit, another social science class was international crime, and those sorts of things. And to make sure that there was a strong incentive for people to take this class, we put it as a social sciences general education credit. Okay, largely because this was going to focus on how people make decisions about technology. Okay, how people make informed decisions about privacy, about security, etc. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the amount of knowledge that goes into understanding these issues. Now, I wanted to present the material at a very technical level. Okay, I want students to not just know, for example, that there were leaks about the NSA, but I wanted them to have a technical opinion on that. I wanted them to understand the technology enough to have an informed opinion. So let's take a look at that kind of chart. So if we think about the NSA leaks, for example, the Snowden leaks, arguably there are other leakers, etc. To have sort of an informed opinion about that, you have to know a little bit about both passive and active surveillance, right? In order to sort of have an opinion about passive surveillance, you have to know a little bit about how traffic sniffing works, about how data mining works. You also have to know a little bit about policy and politics. active surveillance. You also have to know a little bit, in addition to knowing about privacy and politics, a little bit about how exploitation works. Okay? So this is, I think, not easy subject matter. There's a pretty big learning curve here in terms of the amount of tech involved. So the focus of the class, I decided to make the focus of the class examining how, more or less, how security and I guess how how security and policy, et cetera, impacts societal issues. Okay, and look, I want to focus on both the choices made by governments and by individuals. So what that means is that I had to teach people about a lot of very, very different subject matter. So we had to talk about network fundamentals. We had to talk a little bit about offensive and defensive strategies. We had to talk about data mining, about privacy tools, and about certainly some social and political problems. So let's move right into the content. So the distribution of that content, I basically want to split everything up more or less equally between core networking content, security and hacking, data mining and privacy, and contemporary moral issues. So this was what I wanted to do in the class. 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, down at the bottom. As you can see, things went pretty well in terms of the core networking content, which actually surprised me a little bit. Students did very well with that. We spent the security and hacking portion took a little bit more time than I planned. So I actually pared down the amount of time we talked about data mining. And the contemporary moral issues sort of, that went kind of as expected. So overall, I was pretty happy with how things worked out. I would have liked to have maybe spent a little bit more time on data mining and data mining techniques, but it went pretty well. Now, into the actual content. So first off, in the introduction, in the very first lecture, the introductory lecture, I wanted to make a touch on quite a few different issues. So the very first thing I wanted to make sure is that students understood is that they should not be trying this stuff at home. Okay, these are non-technical students. Even experts have a very difficult time deciding when they have crossed the line. So, in fact, in that lecture, I actually literally had "Do not do this at home" in big flashing red letters. We talked about the CFAA and notable cases of prosecution. There we talked about James Otero, and if you don't know who he is, he's not as big of a name as the others on that list. He is the celebrity cell phone hacker, who is sort of actually the prototype, I think, for the CFAA working as the CFAA was intended to work. So he's kind of the baseline. Like, things worked pretty well with him, and then we have some interesting, perhaps, deviations, or maybe not. So we talked about Jeremy Hammond and some of the issues surrounding Jeremy Hammond's case. We talked about Weave. Okay. So we talked about Weave and some of the issues surrounding his case, whether or not it should be considered a CFAA violation to hit a public-facing URL. We talked about Aaron Swartz. We talked about leakers, and we delved into some of the social and political problems. Now, one thing I really wanted to make sure that we talked about in this lecture is that the students understood that in this course, hackers were not the enemy, and that the government also was not the enemy. Okay, so what they really needed to be concerned about in this class, I think, was the tinfoil hat guy. Okay? When you start talking about privacy issues, it's very easy to very quickly get into tinfoil hat territory. Okay? And, I've certainly seen people, once they really start to understand how security violations worked and how easy it was to start penetrating things to, I've seen people say, well, maybe it's time to go off the grid. And I think that's something that when we talk about privacy and when we talk about hacking, we need to make sure that we're kind of preventing this from happening. Okay, we want to make sure that those we're speaking to don't end up putting on the tinfoil hat. Now, in terms of the core concepts of the class, so we covered basic networking. We covered OSI and TCP/IP. Okay, we went into we really focused on application layer, the transport layer, and the network layer. At the application layer, we talked about HTTP and DNS, and for very specific reasons. I think HTTP is pretty much the prototype for an application layer protocol. So if I'm teaching someone what a networking protocol or what an application layer protocol is, HTTP is a perfect example. I spent some time talking about DNS, largely because I wanted students in the class to understand the technical complexity of the technology that we're using. Okay, if you look at DNS through sort of a fresh set of eyes, it is a very complicated thing. And this was actually one of the things that sort of blew students' minds the most in the class. All right, they had no idea that there was that much going on behind the scenes whenever they typed in a URL. At the transport layer, we talked about TCP, and the main reason I focused on TCP is that I wanted them to do some port scanning later. Okay, and at the network layer, we talked about ARP, we talked about routing. We also, in this section, talked about setting up virtual machines, because in theory, in the lab component of the class, I wanted students to be able to set up their own VMs, just go down to the lab and hack a server I had set up down there. I'll talk more about that later. Ended up not quite going as planned. So, defensive security concepts. We talked about risk and doing risk evaluation and risk management strategies. And I think this is an area of security that doesn't receive enough attention, maybe amongst the crowd at DEF CON. Okay? There's a lot to be said about risk, particularly in terms of privacy. And I'll touch on that a little bit later when I start talking about the specific assignments I had in this class. We talked about AV, the different types of antivirus, the various studies of effectiveness or lack thereof. Yeah. If you haven't seen it, Sam Bone has, and I'm going to mention him again later, has a really great little demo on his website for bypassing AV with one line of Python. We talked about firewalls, the purpose of firewalls. Most students had no idea what a firewall was or what it's used for. Once they understood TCP, it suddenly made a lot more sense. And we did some basic firewall configurations. We also talked about a few miscellaneous tools, honeypots, IDS, proxies. But we really spent most of the time on the things that they would encounter on their day-to-day basis. Now, you'll notice that encryption isn't in this section. I'll come back to that, okay? Because we did spend quite a bit of time talking about encryption. Now, offensive security. So this was a class on hacking, okay? And the students were going to be hacking. So we had to spend a lot of time talking about offensive security things. We did your classic reconnaissance stuff, doing OSINT, social media, finding things out on social media, Google, your classic Google hacking, which is another one of the things a little thing that sort of blew students' minds. We looked at traffic sniffing using Wireshark. We went through kind of the classic attack strategy. We did port scanning and host identification. We did quite a bit of exploitation, both network and web-based. And web-based, we looked at sort of the classic ones, Squilly, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery. We talked about post-exploitation, pivoting, doing privilege escalation, although that, I think, was beyond having them do that, I think, was beyond a general education expectation. And then we talked a little bit about what happens when you're done, right? So clearing up logs, removing data, basically getting out of Dodge. In terms of data mining, we focused mainly on social network analysis. So I also talked about k-means clustering and Bayesian inference, but we spent most of the time talking about social network analysis because it was largely the piece of data mining that was most relevant to them. Okay, and there we talked about social graph modeling, okay, how to model social units with nodes, arcs, direction, bidirection, the information that can be gleaned thereof. We talked about some basic analytic concepts, symmetry, for example. Symmetry is a great concept because there's so many really easy examples to sort of demo how much information can be gained by looking at the symmetry of a relationship. The example I really love to use there is looking at Facebook messaging. Okay, so imagine you've got two nodes in a graph, and your arc labels are the number of messages exchanged via Facebook. Now, if you've got, let's say, 4 going from Alice to Bob, 4 going from Bob to Alice, that's a very symmetrical relationship. All right. If you've got 1 message from Alice to Bob and 20 from Bob to Alice, you could very easily infer that Bob's probably a creepy guy. Okay. We talked about dark nodes and dark graphs, sort of inferring what's missing from a graph. We looked at some data mining programs, and when I say programs, I don't mean software to do data mining, but rather we looked at how these companies were sort of using their data mining. We looked at Gmail data mining, and there I actually was able to, using a fresh Gmail account, send an email to another address, asking that address if they wanted to get pizza later. And then I started getting pizza ads delivered to my web browser. So that actually worked out pretty well. We talked about Facebook mining and some of the things that Facebook has done in terms of their political experimentations. And we certainly looked at mass surveillance, the difference between mass surveillance or passive surveillance, if you will, and targeted or active surveillance. Okay. And I really want to make it sort of drive that home. Now, moving on, privacy tools. We talked about encryption, and there I took sort of a classic computer science approach to this, where we actually talked a little bit about complexity theory and cryptographic strength, which the students did pretty well with. I mean, complexity theory is one of your upper level concepts in computer science. One of the weightier concepts, and we had it turned out to be pretty well. It turned out pretty well. We talked about asymmetric versus symmetric crypto. We talked about PKI versus the web of trust. In terms of cryptographic tools, we looked at BitLocker and TrueCrypt. And yes, I know TrueCrypt is all the stuff that happened with TrueCrypt, right? The audit actually finished about a week before I was going to give this lecture. So that everything worked out pretty nicely there. I had a very good excuse to use TrueCrypt and to bring in some of the discussion about what happened with TrueCrypt. And students really sort of ate that up. For asymmetric crypto, we looked at HTTPS Everywhere and GPG, Thunderbird, and Enigmail. We also took a look at some secure messaging apps. There weren't any ones that... We didn't spend an extensive amount of time talking about the secure messaging apps because that was something that came into play a little bit later in the class. We talked about onion routing. There we used the Tor browser bundle. And let me just say I have really cool sysadmins and network admins who had absolutely no problem with me using Tor on the campus networks. My network admins basically said, Just tell us what you want to do, more or less, and as long as you're not like hacking our servers, we'll help you out with whatever you want to do. So that was pretty cool. And then we looked at a bunch of browser extensions. NoScript, and when we talked about NoScript, we talked both about the potential gain from NoScript and the potential loss, right? I mean, what happens as soon as you kick NoScript on, half the web becomes unusable, probably 75%. We looked at Ghostery and Adblock, as well as Privacy Badger. Okay? And the contemporary moral problems. So this was really the rest of everything we've done up to this point was sort of prerequisite knowledge for these kinds of discussions. So we talked about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act reform, and we looked at the case of Aaron Swartz in great detail. We looked at hacktivism and spent a great deal of time talking about Anonymous. The regulation of encryption. Halfway through the semester, Wassenaar started popping up. Okay, so the Wassenaar Agreement and this security research regulation became a very big issue. Also, right about the time Chris Roberts took a trip on an airplane. Okay, if you're not familiar with Chris Roberts, it's a very interesting case. I suggest you go look it up. We also talked about the use of surveillance technologies. And there we looked at Snowden, the NSA leaks, and quite a bit of, we also in that section talked about some of the earlier leaks as well, dating back to like Bill Binney in 2000, I think it was 2002. So we looked at both the technology, in this section we looked at both the technologies, in other words, what technologies were actually being used for surveillance, and how they were being used in practice. Okay? By which I mean there are some very interesting cases of these anti-terrorism surveillance technologies being used to do things like, of course, spy on I think it was the foreign minister in Brazil during trade negotiations. Okay? Now, at this point, let me just make a couple of observations about teaching this class. So, number one, there is no single or even small collection of textbooks that cover this material. So students love that, since they didn't have to buy a book for the class. That made my job as an instructor much more difficult because I had to spend quite a bit of time cultivating material that they could look at. Two, and this was one that I actually did not really expect. I'm of the opinion that professors should make a reasonable effort to present both sides of issues and let their students make up their own minds. It's my job to present information, not a political position. Okay? And this was very, very difficult in this case because the majority of the material, at least of the convincing material, is not coming from the the surveillance side of the issue, or the anti-privacy side of the issue. Okay, there was I found very, very little information, very, very little convincing presentations, information, particularly evidentiary-based information, to support any of the anti-privacy arguments. Okay, I mean, but on the other hand, that's sort of what we expect, right? I mean, what does the anti-privacy side usually use? Terrorism, kidnapping, and child porn, and that's it. That's more or less it. And there's very little, very little going beyond that. Okay, these are very, very superficial arguments with very little evidence that seems to back them up. Now, the third observation is that I think instructors teaching the subject matter need to be really flexible. This was, as I said, during our spring semester, which ran from January this year until May of this year, during which we had Superfish, okay, certainly a big privacy issue. We had Chris Roberts and the plane hacking. We had Golden Key Crypto start up again. Okay, and we had the Wassenaar Agreement start to happen. So these start to, really get a lot of attention. So these were all issues of significant, of really, that were really significant that I sort of had to prepare for in a short amount of time. Okay, so this is a very, very dynamic subject area, and I think in order to cover it in a way that's relevant to students, we as instructors have to be up on current events to a certain extent. Okay, so specific resources. So what did I actually use, give students to teach this class? So in the introductory lecture, I gave them two things to read. First is a story about Jessica written by the Swift on Security account, InfoSec Taylor Swift. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great story about I think a 17-year-old girl who accidentally gets malware infected on her computer. And the question, the moral of the story is, this girl is a perfectly normal user. She didn't really seem to do anything wrong, but yet she still ended up having some pretty bad security and privacy problems. I moved from that to Everything is Broken by Quinn Norton, which was both the first reading and last reading of the semester. Okay, so this is a great article that details how and why there are so many security problems in the internet. Okay. So the first reading, students were like, well, no, it can't be that bad, right? This has got to be a very pessimistic view. And at the end of the semester, they're like, holy crap, that was right. Okay? So there was a very big shift. And the third really, I think, very useful resource at the beginning of the semester was the hearing on healthcare.gov security, specifically one of the videos on Representative Bernice Johnson's YouTube account. And let me just play the first few minutes of this. I'm not sure if I'm going to have audio, though. Let me just back out of this for 1 second. Oh, that's fun. Oh, there we go. Does this work if I hold the mic up? Oh. Got two of them going.
From a website, but you did not mention which site that was. Was this the healthcare.com?
It's part of the same infrastructure. Without the
Excuse me. Was it a part of the healthcare.com?
Yes.
So you were able to get that information from healthcare.com?
It's from the infrastructure from healthcare.gov.
Better?
It's from, if you look at what makes up healthcare.gov, if you go to www.healthcare.gov, that's one site and server. But what makes up healthcare.gov is chat.healthcare.gov, finder.healthcare.gov, data.healthcare.gov. There's multiple things that feed information into the main website. So you have all of these different working parts that feed into what makes up healthcare.gov and that entire infrastructure, and that's what we found the exposure on.
Healthcare.gov.
On the infrastructure, on one of the subsites for healthcare.gov.
But not the site of healthcare.gov.
That is correct.
Dr. Rubin.
Yeah, so that part I think is a very interesting exchange. Yeah. So basically, she's asking, Dave Kennedy had sort of talked about how he had he had been able to get access to user accounts or user information on the healthcare.gov on the data.healthcare.gov subdomain. Okay, so she shoots back and says, you found it on data.healthcare.gov, but not healthcare.gov. And he responds by saying, yes, they're part of the same infrastructure. They talk to each other. And she shoots back by saying, so it wasn't healthcare.gov. Okay? So the reason I brought this up at sort of this introductory point is because it shows, I think, some of the problems that we're up against in dealing with these issues. Okay? So this really sort of brought up the fact that these there are a lot of very, very important people out there that don't have a very solid understanding of how technology works, even basic technology like websites. And to a certain extent, the students in this class didn't either. However, even the students who had no experience with anything on the back end at this point, or at least that was my expectation, got the fact that we had some elected officials here making important decisions about technology without understanding how that technology works. Okay? Now, to a certain extent, right, we also have to keep in mind that it's not the job of elected officials to be web admins. Right? It's not their job to understand how everything about websites work, or everything about how the internet works. Right? Your average, I guess your most representatives probably don't need to know the details, for example, of how DNS works. But they do need to understand enough to make informed decisions that are based in technology, not in policy. Okay? And that was, I think, something that was going on here. So we had a security expert who was talking a little bit about how there were some security problems, and we had a representative who saw this as a political issue. And I think that's what this video clip highlights. So moving on to additional resources. So in terms of the offensive security content of the course, at least in terms of lab exercises, I highly recommend Sam Bone's material. He has some great stuff out there. One of the lab assignments I borrowed very heavily from his content, which is, I think, Creative Commons licensed. When we talked about privacy tools, we took a look at, when talking about Tor, we took a look at the Tor project's overview. I think that's one of the best summaries of how Tor works. And as a side note, Tor was actually, in terms of privacy tools, one of the things students kind of got the easiest, because it's one of the very few things in technology and in security and privacy that works just like it does in the movies. Okay? Or almost like it does in the movies. Okay? It's routing your hops around the world. Okay? And we've been seeing that in the movies since Sneakers. Okay? We took a look at the EFF secure messaging scorecard, and when we talked about that, there were some students who very quickly removed some things from their phones. We talked about the privacy scorecard, the EFF's privacy scorecard. The who's got your back list, and students again had some really interesting. They found it sort of very eye-opening. And we also used Epic's online guide to privacy tools, and that was actually a part of one of their lab assignments. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, in terms of resources used to discuss the contemporary moral issues, the contemporary issues, if you will, I started them off talking about hacker culture with the DEF CON documentary. I think that's a little bit of a good introduction to the hacker mentality and hacker culture. Okay. We quickly moved into talking about hacktivism, and there we looked at the We Are Legion documentary by Brian Knappenberger, which is a great documentary. We looked at the Anonymous and Ourselves DEF CON talk by Josh Corman, Jericho, and Cryptia. We talked a little bit about OPSEC for activists, and when talking about OPSEC for activists, we used the Don't Fuck It Up talk last year from Zaz, which was, I had to make sure that the volume wasn't up too high on that one. We looked at The Internet's Own Boy, again by Brian Appenberger, when moving into some of the issues surrounding nation-state hacking and sort of these mass surveillance issues. We used it to protect and infect. The second part by Jake Applebaum, I think that was the 2013 Chaos Communications conference. And in that, he basically Jake Applebaum basically details the TAO playlist, right? Everything in the TAO catalog. And I use that very specifically to highlight the difference between active and passive surveillance, right? Passive surveillance is very clearly collecting everything, whereas this was entirely active surveillance technologies. Okay, this is very specifically being targeted. There's also some really eye-opening technology in that. Okay. And wrapping this up, we took a look at a TED Talk by a guy named Alejandro Acquisiti. I probably didn't pronounce that correctly. What will a future without secrets look like? Alessandro is a researcher at Carnegie Mellon who took a look at a number of very concerning privacy technologies, one of them being very, very quick and efficient facial recognition technologies. They had in this talk, he talks about a survey that he had people do. They took a picture of participants as a part of the survey, and by the end of the survey, they asked the person, "Is this you?" So by the end of the survey, they had used the picture to find the participant's Facebook account, and that was actually pretty effective. In this talk, he also goes into some of the work that's being done, work that's being done for advertising purposes in terms of creating very targeted advertisements. So he looks at some of the very targeted advertising techniques where, for example, they'll craft an ad specifically for you by merging the faces of two of your friends. So you don't necessarily recognize that this is a composite image, but yet you're still more likely to buy into the advertisement. We looked at Mikko Hipponen's talk, the talk I was going to give at RSA, Mikko Hipponen's talk from TrustyCon, which is a very interesting talk about nation-state hacking. And then we kind of wrapped up with the White Hat's Dilemma by Alex Stamos, which is a really nice summary of some of the problems facing security, some of the moral issues facing security researchers. And actually, as we were doing the White Hat Dilemma talk, he sort of poses a number of questions to the audience. And as we were doing that, I posed the questions to the students as well. We sort of paused while the students thought about it and voted. It was interesting to see the responses. So now, lab setup. So let me move into talking about some of the very specific assignments for this class. So I had a small scale lab. This class had about 25 students in it. This lab was also running the material for my ethical hacking classes this semester. We ran one Netgear home router, which, by the way, I had just bought. Anyone want to guess what I found on the router when I popped it open and did a scan of it? Nope. Worse. Telnet. Bingo. Brand new router with Telnet running. Yeah, students had fun with that, though. We had one victim 2008 Windows 2008 server. We had one victim Windows 8 computer. And we had two Kali attack machines. Okay? Now, that sounds like not a lot of attack machines, but remember this class had labs, but we weren't doing it in a laboratory. Okay? So these were their homework assignments. They had to go down to this open lab and use the computers there. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted students to do virtualization for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted students to see Linux because Linux is cool, and I think it's useful for students to see that there's an alternative to Windows and Windows and Macs. So their assignment was to create or import several VMs. They had to do Ubuntu, Kali, Tails, and a VM or an ISO of their choice. This went miserably. Okay, probably 2/3 of my students for this class did not have computers capable of running VirtualBox. Okay, so I had to add more resources to the lab after this. This was a nightmare. Lab number 2. So this is where we start getting into the hacking component of the class. With lab number 2, I wanted students to see a little bit about how hackers operated. So once again, remember this is a general education class, no prerequisites. So this was presented very much at a script kiddie level. Okay? And in this, what they had to do is crack a web key to get into a network. They had to do a port scan of the network. They had to find a vulnerable FTP server on the network and run a Metasploit module against it. Okay, so again, I presented this very much at a script kiddie kind of level. Once they got into the FTP server, they had to find a file, I think it was like a bank accounts file, okay, with bank account numbers in it. The FTP server, again, I just blatantly stole that part from Sam Bone. But the rest of it was my creation. So there we just needed a router with WEP and a victim victim FTP server that the students could hit, as well as some traffic being generated on the network so that they could actually capture packets to crack the web key. So this went pretty well. Okay, students were able to do this without too many problems. Okay, and once again, students with no background in computer science were able to do this with very few problems. And the reason I picked these things specifically is, first of all, cracking a web key, right? So that's breaking into a network, okay? Students can relate to the idea of getting onto someone else's wireless network. Finding a file on a computer with sensitive information. Again, that's something that students are very concerned about. Okay? Not so much necessarily the exploiting an FTP server, but scanning a network does really show how enumeration works. It also shows how much information your computer is sort of leaking without, all the time. Okay, how much information is being leaked all the time just in virtue of having open ports. So lab number 3 was where they really got freaked out, particularly the girls in the class. Lab number 3, use a Java-signed applet to distribute Meterpreter to the victim computer and turn on the webcam and then take a picture of your lab partner. Okay? The resources needed, a webcam. That was it. Okay? And again, this lab went so flawlessly. Like, I did not have to go down and fix anything for this. This went perfectly. And this freaked them out. Okay, they were shocked at how easy it was to do this. Now, again, we were using Metasploit and Meterpreter, so it's kind of, it's sort of set up to be easy, but yeah, they found this very easy. Lab number 4, remember I said I dropped some of the data mining content. What I had planned for lab 4, and I'm putting lab in quotation marks because it was really an assignment, and I had forgotten to list labs as call this both labs and assignments in the syllabus. So lab 4 was using multiple types of data. Okay, so I would give them an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of different kinds of data in it, like GPS data, financial data, etc. And they had to sort of create a social graph and infer which people were having an affair. Okay, which people in this were having an affair. Unfortunately, I had to drop this one because of time constraints. Because I wanted them to do lab 5, which was privacy tools. So for lab 5, I wanted them to develop a self-threat assessment. In other words, think about what kind of privacy issues they wanted to protect themselves against. I wanted them to, look at Epic's list of online privacy tools and discuss how they would use those, look at 5 of those tools and talk about how they would use those tools for their own privacy purposes. Okay? So this went pretty well. I'll talk about some observations, talk about this in a second. So the last part of their grade, leaving aside the midterm and final exam, was a term paper. So we had your classic agree, disagree term papers on backdoor crypto, leakers, hacktivism, etc. We had some really interesting. I gave some really interesting options, like reading Little Brother and Homeland by Cory Doctorow, and doing an evaluation of the technology used. So in other words, how realistic are these books actually? Okay, the term paper that most of the students picked, or that the most students picked, was "Is Hacker Culture Healthy?" Yeah, and they had some interesting thoughts on that. As a side note, they had some very interesting thoughts on that. I got a very wide range of opinions, with very many people saying, particularly after watching the DEF CON documentary, that there were maybe some issues that we have in terms of sort of gender equality. And for them, gender equality and racial equality. So something to maybe think about. So the results of the class. And I'm putting, again, results in quotation marks because I'm not going to talk about any statistics or any grade distributions or anything like that. These are just my observations. So number one, students seem to be really interested in the technology behind these privacy issues. Okay? They love this class. Number two, and this is more of a technical observation, students were using a really wide range of equipment. I sort of very underestimated how wide of an ecosystem I would see here. And that we had a few problems related to that. Observation 3, and I think this may be of more interest to the people in the room, students were generally more concerned about threats to privacy from individuals that they knew or from nation states. They did not particularly seem to be concerned about privacy as it relates to corporations and corporate data mining. And in terms of privacy tools, students generally thought that most privacy tools were unusable. So there, only one student out of 25 was able to get GPG working. Not a very good success rate. Most of the students preferred browser plugins. Okay, so things like AdBlock Plus, Privacy Badger, students really liked those and thought that they would continue using those in the future. Okay? And sort of the conclusions to wrap this up. This class went amazingly well. This is the first class I've ever had where students asked me for more work and more content. Okay? They loved this. They immediately grasped the importance of the content, the relevance to current issues, the relevance to their personal lives. And finally, because of the success of this, I really hope to turn this into a regularly offered general education class. So, any questions? I would love to do that, yes. So I hope to do that in the future. Yep, that's exactly what I encountered. And as soon as I taught them a little bit about some of the technology and some of the privacy issues, they went a little bit over too far in the other direction, which goes back to, as I was saying, the real enemy here was the tinfoil hat guy. Okay, I really spent a lot of time making sure that students did not start putting on their tinfoil hats. But yes, I hope to do that in the future. Yes?
When you're working with these students, have you seen a difference in needles with respect to technology and how to set the
That's a really interesting question. So I had a very small sample. So this class had 25 students in it. These very almost a perfectly even distribution between freshman and senior. So almost an even distribution amongst all the age levels that one sees in a typical college class. I did not have any non-traditional students. And in terms of their level of technical adoption, I did see quite a bit of variance. So I had some people who had already bought the Apple Watch, and I had some students who were running a single core laptop with 2 gigs of RAM. Okay, I suspect that is largely related not necessarily to any sort of preference, but because of income issues. Any other questions? Oh, one other thing. The part of privacy that students found most concerning was mobile technology. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.